Okay, so you know all those grammar rules we learned back in school, like the ones that felt like they were totally set in stone. What if some of those rules, aren't really that important anymore? Especially now with so much online communication that's so quick and casual.
That's a really fascinating thought. Makes you think about, which of those old grammar rules actually matter for understanding each other.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be looking into today in this deep dive. We're going to be talking about some interesting ideas and perspectives from a couple sources. We've got this really great article from thesaurus.com called Five Grammar Rules You Don't Actually Need to Follow. And we're also going to touch on some ideas from the Master English podcast, which is really great at, kind of shaking things up and challenging the old ways of thinking about grammar.
It's a good mix. I like how the thesaurus.com article really gets specific about certain rules that aren't really being followed much anymore. And then the Master English podcast is good for, exploring why it can actually be a good thing to be a little more relaxed about grammar. Like it can help us communicate better sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great point. So for everyone listening, this deep dive is all about helping you guys see things a little differently. Maybe let go of some of that worry about grammar, especially, when you're texting or posting online. It's more about getting your point across and sounding natural than, you know, being perfect with every grammar rule.
For sure. It's important to remember that language is always changing. What was a hard and fast rule 50 years ago might just be a suggestion today. So where do you want to start with all this?
Let's start with those words we all use sometimes when we're talking,
Hmm.
those filler words, like,
Yeah, those are good ones. Thesaurus.com calls them conversational lubricants. I like that.
right.
They say that these were traditionally, frowned upon, especially in formal speeches and presentations. The idea was to sound more confident and to, avoid seeming hesitant.
Right. That makes sense when you're giving a formal presentation and you want to come across as really polished and in control of the information. But then the article talks about how these filler words are actually fine and sometimes even good to use in texts, casual conversations, and online stuff. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because those little pauses and phrases make things sound more natural, more like how people actually talk. Like thesaurus.com says, it can make communication feel more real and personal, especially in digital conversations. When you read a text with a you know in it, it almost feels like you can hear the person's voice. It can sometimes make the message softer or give the other person a chance to, think about what you just said.
Yeah, that's interesting about giving the other person time to think. It seems like the Master English podcast would agree with this idea of sounding natural when you speak, even if they don't talk about filler words directly. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. They're all about focusing on real life communication. And those little hesitations and filler words are definitely a part of that. So, for our listeners, the takeaway here is that it's okay to use these filler words in casual conversations. It doesn't mean you're unsure about what you're saying, it's just how people talk naturally.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to another grammar challenge that I know I've messed up a lot. Knowing when to use who versus whom.
Ah, the classic who and whom problem. Thesaurus.com mentions how many of us learn this with that little saying, he for who and whom for him. Did that help you at all?
To be honest, that always made it more confusing for me. Thesaurus.com makes a good point when they say that so many people find this rule so hard that they're basically giving up and just using who all the time.
Yeah, and that's a great example of how grammar can be affected by how people actually use it. When a rule is too complicated or doesn't sound natural, people tend to stop using it in everyday communication. And thesaurus.com says that in most informal situations, it's fine to use who.
I also thought it was a good suggestion that if you're not sure which one to use, just rephrase the sentence. Like instead of agonizing over to whom did you send that email, you can simply ask, who did you send that email to? Or who was the recipient of that email? Much easier.
Exactly. It shows that what's really important is being able to communicate clearly. You don't always have to follow every grammar rule perfectly. So, listeners, if you're debating between who and whom in a casual message, it's probably fine to just use who, or you can quickly change the sentence so you don't even have to worry about it.
Great advice. Okay, now let's talk about abbreviations and acronyms. Like LOL, BRB, and OMG.
So, thesaurus.com does a nice job of showing how differently we treat these in formal writing versus our you know, quick digital chats. In a formal report, you probably spell out the full name the first time you use an acronym, like United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO.
Yeah, but can you imagine typing that whole thing out in a text? It would be so clunky. Like trying to type, laughing out loud, my cat just tried to eat a dust bunny. LOL. It just wouldn't work.
You're right. Thesaurus.com gets it. They explain how acronyms are super helpful in digital communication. We all know what the common ones mean, so they let us be quick and to the point, which is important when there are character limits or when you're having a fast conversation.
So it sounds like it's totally fine to use common acronyms in text, social media, and instant messages. They're just part of how we talk online now, and everyone gets it.
Yeah, it's all about knowing the situation and who you're talking to. You might want to be a little more careful with less common acronyms. But in general, online communication, they're totally fine.
All right, next up is a phrase that always makes me cringe a bit, even though I know a lot of people say it. Between you and I.
I understand that. Thesaurus.com explains that the correct grammatical form is between you and me. That's because between is a preposition, and prepositions are followed by object pronouns.
Yeah, that's the rule I learned. But then thesaurus.com mentions that between you and I is really common in casual talk and writing. And some grammarians even argue that it's fine to use it sometimes.
It's interesting, isn't it, how people actually use language can sometimes bend the rules. They even talk about between me and you as an even more casual version, even though technically it's also not correct.
So what would you tell our listeners about this one?
Well, while between you and me is still technically correct, between you and I is so common in everyday conversation that it's not a big deal. It's one of those things that people don't worry about too much in casual situations.
So moving on, let's talk about something my teachers always said not to do. Starting a sentence with a conjunction. You know, words like and, but, because, however.
Yes, that was a big no-no. But thesaurus.com has some interesting information about that rule. It turns out it was never actually a real rule.
Really? I always felt like I was breaking some big grammar law when I did that.
I know, right? Even the Chicago Manual of Style, which is a really respected guide for writing, says that people have been starting sentences with conjunctions for centuries. Even really traditional writers do it.
So all that time I spent trying to reword sentences so they didn't start with and or but might have been a waste of time.
Pretty much. Thesaurus.com makes it clear that unless you're writing something very formal or following a specific style guide, it's fine to start a sentence with a conjunction. In fact, it can often make your writing sound more natural and more like how people actually talk. So go ahead and start that sentence with but if it feels right.
Now let's move to some of the rules from the Master English podcast that they say we can ignore. They start by talking about the rule about never ending a sentence with a preposition.
Right. This rule can sometimes make sentences sound really stiff and awkward if you follow it too strictly. The podcast gives a good example, comparing "this is the matter about which I wish to inquire" with the simpler "this is the matter I wanted to inquire about."
Yeah, that first one sounds so formal, like something out of an old legal document.
The podcast explains that this rule actually came from Latin grammar, which is different from English. English speakers have been ending sentences with prepositions for a long time without any problems. Think about everyday questions like, who are you waiting for? Or, what are you looking at? Those sound perfectly normal.
So it sounds like it's perfectly okay to end your sentences with prepositions. It won't make your English bad.
Yep. It's more important to be clear and sound natural than to follow a rule that doesn't really make sense for English.
Okay, what about the rule against splitting infinitives? You know, like putting an adverb between to and the verb, like in to boldly go.
Ah, yes. And another grammar rule that some people get really picky about. But the Master English podcast points out that while traditional grammarians don't like it, splitting infinitives is actually pretty common in English.
And they even say that sometimes it's easier for our brains to understand a sentence when the infinitive is split because the adverb is closer to the verb it's describing.
That's pretty cool, huh? The way our brains work with language. They tell a funny story about a French student who tried to correct the sentence, I want to immediately address this, to I want to address this immediately. It just shows that what's technically correct can sometimes sound less natural to native speakers.
So don't worry too much about splitting infinitives. It often sounds more natural and is easier to understand, like in sentences like, I need to really focus on this, or I want to quickly finish this task.
Right. It's about communicating clearly and naturally.
The Master English podcast also talks about the old advice to never use contractions in formal writing. I've noticed that people are more relaxed about this these days.
I agree. The podcast makes a good argument that this rule is getting outdated. They compare the very formal, it is not advisable to use contractions, to the friendlier, it's okay to use contractions in many formal situations. Which one sounds better to you?
The second one definitely sounds better. And the podcast talks about how contractions like I'm and don't are just how people normally talk. So using them can make your writing and speaking sound more authentic and interesting.
For sure. And using contractions can actually make you sound more relatable and less stiff in professional situations, too. Like in business emails, presentations, and even some academic papers. Like the podcast says, I won't be able to attend. Just sounds better and more natural than I will not be able to attend.
So it's not always necessary to avoid contractions to sound formal. How formal you sound depends more on the overall tone and the situation than on whether or not you use contractions.
You got it. It's about being professional and clear without sounding like a robot.
The podcast then talks about how we don't always have to use complete sentences when we're speaking casually. I know I use sentence fragments all the time when I'm talking.
Yeah, me too. It's just how people speak. The podcast explains that people don't always think in perfect sentences. We often use fragments in spoken language to emphasize things, show emotions, or just to make the conversation flow better.
They give a good example of how someone would describe a movie they loved. They'd probably use sentence fragments because it would sound more natural and exciting, like, incredible visuals, amazing soundtrack, totally blew me away.
Yeah, that definitely sounds more like a real person talking. The podcast says that those sentence fragments, things like, no problem, absolutely, couldn't agree more, aren't mistakes when you're talking casually. They're a normal part of conversation and a good way to emphasize things.
So listeners, don't feel like you have to use perfect sentences all the time when you're talking to people. It's okay to use sentence fragments, especially in casual conversations. It sounds more natural that way.
It really does.
Okay, last but not least, the Master English podcast talks about a very important and evolving part of language, using they as a singular pronoun.
This is a great example of how language changes to better reflect how we think about gender. The podcast says that even though traditional grammar says they is plural, people are using it more and more as a singular pronoun when they don't know someone's gender or when talking about someone who identifies as non-binary.
And this isn't just some small trend either, right? The podcast mentions that even major style guides and dictionaries are now accepting the use of they as a singular pronoun.
That's right. It's becoming more common, and it's an important way to be respectful and inclusive. The podcast gives examples like someone left their phone on the table, or if a student needs help, they should ask their teacher. Using singular they in those cases sounds natural and avoids making assumptions about gender.
So the takeaway here is that it's perfectly fine to use they as a singular pronoun in lots of situations. And it's also a great way to be inclusive and respectful of everyone.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that language changes to meet the needs of the people who use it.
Wow, we've talked about a lot of stuff today. It's really interesting how many grammar rules we learned in school are actually a lot more flexible than we thought, especially these days.
Yeah, and it really shows that the most important thing about language is being able to connect with each other and communicate clearly. Like the Master English podcast says, it's also about having the courage to express yourself naturally and not being afraid to make a few grammar mistakes.
So to all our listeners, as you go about your day, maybe think about which of these so-called rules you might want to relax a little. It might help you sound more natural and confident when you're communicating. Which of these grammar rules do you feel like you could let go of a little?
It's a great question to think about. Language is always changing, and we should be open to using it in ways that help us understand each other better and connect in a genuine way.
So let's all try to speak a little more freely, write a little more confidently, and embrace the fact that the English language is always evolving. Thanks for listening to our deep dive today.